נשמע נכון.
All right, welcome back everybody. We're in breakout one, just make sure everyone's in the right room. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor Prowler. They're a gold sponsor for Forward Cloud Stack. We appreciate their continued contributions to the community. Let me get in the picture. Let's see. Prowler is the leading open source tool for multi-cloud security best practices assessment, auditing, and hardening. It helps identify vulnerabilities, ensures compliance, and improves cloud security posture with comprehensive checks and actionable insights. AWS recommends Prowler for its robust security and compliance management capabilities. All right, thank you, Prowler. And for this talk, we have Nir Ohfeld, and we have Hillai Ben-Sasson. And the talk is the EKS Hacking Playbook, Lessons from 3 Years of Cloud Security Research. Take it away, guys.
Thank you. So yeah, our talk is the EKS Hackers Playbook, Lessons from 3 Years of Cloud Security Research. So just a quick who are we before we begin. My name is Nir Ohfeld, and here with me on stage is Hillai Ben-Sasson. We are both security researchers, a part of Wiz Research Team, and you can find us on Twitter with the handle Nir Ohfeld and @Hillai. Now, you might be already familiar with some of our previous work, notable cloud incidents like ChaosDB, OMIGOD, Bing Bang, and actually many, many more. And we have more coming out soon, so stay tuned about our blog. Now, as you may already picked it up, we hack cloud providers for a living. And after a while, we start noticing some patterns, things that work for us again and again across companies, across services, and even across cloud providers. So naturally, we devised ourselves a little playbook. And using this playbook, we were able to hack the world's biggest cloud services. And today, we're going to share with you like a small portion of that playbook, specifically the EKS portion. And we thought it'd be beneficial if we start with a quick recap of basic Kubernetes terminology to make sure that we are all aligned. So let's begin. Okay, so what is Kubernetes? Kubernetes is a container management platform. A container is basically a lightweight image containing the software and its dependencies. Let's assume that you wrote some app and you want to share it with your friend. The way to ensure that it works on his machine, the way it works on your machine, is to use a container. It will have all the dependencies that you need, regardless of the operating system he's using. And what do you do when you have like a bunch of containers? You opt in for some kind of a container management platform like Kubernetes, which helps you to automate the deployment and management of those containerized apps. Now, going a bit further to more like Kubernetes-specific terminology. So a pod is basically a bunch of containers in a single unit, and a bunch of pods are running on a node. And the node is like basically a virtual machine, EC2 in AWS terminology. And a bunch of nodes are a cluster. So just a quick recap. You have a container. A bunch of containers are a pod, a bunch of pods are a node, and a bunch of nodes are a cluster. And all of these components are being managed by the Kubernetes control plane. Each node has like a small agent that communicates with the API server that manages and orchestrates the cluster. And EKS is basically the marriage of these two. Using EKS, you can immerse like the great power that Kubernetes gives you with the AWS platform, giving you one very powerful and very popular solution. We can see it like across all of our customers and research targets that are utilizing EKS in order to run their apps. But EKS is kind of a beast with two-headed beast, because on one hand, you have like Kubernetes security best practices, and you have AWS security best practices, and marrying these two actually creates a new category of EKS security best practices. And during our research, we found that many companies from completely different industries are falling victim to simple security misconfigurations that are unique for EKS. For an example, in almost every security engagement that we do, we begin with some sort of network sniffing. Whether it be Wireshark or TCP dump, we want to get a hang of the network, and maybe sometimes it even gets us a quick win. And one kind of traffic that is unique for EKS is EKS pod identity. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with EKS pod identity, it's relatively a new feature in EKS that provides a seamless and a secretless way of accessing AWS resources from EKS pods. Now, this is a very overly simplified version of a diagram for EKS pod identity. And if you want to learn more about this feature and exactly how it works, we have a great blog post by Shai Berkovich from our threat research team going through all of the implementation details of EKS pod identity. But it will serve perfectly for our purposes. So we have a pod that needs to access some private data in a private S3 bucket. How do you make sure that the pod has the right permissions and the identity for that? Essentially, you need some way to bridge the gap between the Kubernetes identity and the AWS identity. And this is exactly where the pod identity agent comes into play. In every EKS pod identity enabled cluster, every node has the pod identity agent. Like a simple HTTP server that maps between Kubernetes identity and AWS identity. So behind the scenes, when you use bot2.3 to access any kind of AWS resource, it will send an HTTP request with your Kubernetes credentials, and in return, will get AWS credentials. And this is kind of a sensitive HTTP request. Imagine an attacker getting hold of this, both the request and the response. If he gets hold of the request, he'll get your Kubernetes permission that may allow him to lateral move within the environment, or if he gets hold of the response, he can perform lateral movement within the AWS account. So you're surprised to find out this is not encrypted traffic, meaning that any attacker that manages to spawn a pod within the same network namespace as your pod can actually just sniff the traffic and get both the Kubernetes identity and the IAM credentials for your account. Now, so as I mentioned, in every engagement, we begin with some network scanning. But this doesn't always yield something useful, and we need to take some kind of more proactive measures. And for that, we do container registry scraping, a technique that proved to be very successful in the recent years. But before we can talk about container registry scraping, we need to talk about how do we authenticate to container registries. In vanilla Kubernetes installations, you have the image pool secret. This is essentially the way that your pod authenticates to the container registry and starts pulling images. This secret contains both the username and password in order to authenticate to that registry. So how does it work in AWS, in EKS? So the same idea, you have a command called AWS ECR get login password that yields the same result, gets the username and the password for that registry. And this is where Kubernetes and EKS differ a bit. While the access to image pool secrets depends on Kubernetes permission, the access to get login password depends on AWS permissions. Okay, so I got my password and I logged into the container registry. Now what? I can start pulling out images and inspecting their layers. And during our research, we found tons of interesting stuff in those layers, things like secrets, credentials, proprietary source code, and essentially anything else that you can imagine. But no need to imagine, because we have a case study. Last year, our head of research, Shir Tamari, and another very talented researcher from our team, Ronen Shustin, conducted a research about the Alibaba Cloud Analytic DB service. They first executed code on their instance and escaped from the pod to the node and contacted the Kubernetes API and fetched the image pool secret. They started pulling images and inspecting the layers, hoping to find anything useful. But then again, they returned to those credentials and decided to inspect their permissions. While they expected that the image pool secrets will give them pool permission, they were surprised to find out that it also gave them push permission. Now, with these permissions, any attacker getting hold of these credentials can execute a sophisticated supply chain attack, yielding that all of the customers will pull their images instead of the cloud provider images. And we actually prepared a very nice animation to illustrate exactly that risk. So you have your attacker on the left, executing code on its attacker database on the right. The attacker will later escape to the node and communicate with the Kubernetes API server to fetch the image pool secrets credentials. Now, using these credentials, he can authenticate to the internal container registry and push his own malicious image. an image that will later be used by other customers' database instances, eventually giving him a foothold in their environment. But what we later found out is that this internal container registry is actually being used by other services within the platform, meaning that this is actually a cross-service vulnerability. The image pool secrets that the attacker managed to gain from the analytic.db service served as a way in for other Alibaba cloud products and other customers' environments. Now, if you want to learn more about this research, because this is really just the beginning, you can find out more at our blog, wiz.io/blog, or at Hillai's talk at last year's KubeCon. And with that, I want to invite my very good friend and colleague, Hillai Ben-Sasson, to walk you through the next part of our presentation.
All right. Thank you, Nir. OK, so let's go back to networking. After we sniff network traffic, let's talk about the active approach, scanning an internal network. Now, whenever you go to major cloud providers' internal networks, you might find yourself with a big mess of tons of IP addresses and ports. You might want to focus yourself on some specific parts of the network. So let's talk about exposed file shares. All right, so when you're using EKS and you're looking for a persistent storage solution, you might be wanting to use any of these readily available storage solutions from Amazon, tools you know and love like S3, EFS, FSX, etc. Now, the way you would use them, and the nice thing about using Kubernetes in particular, is that you don't have to write any actual code. You just use the CSI driver as a drop-in replacement. You don't really care about what happens behind the scenes. You don't have to actually write code that communicates with the storage server. You just use the CSI driver, and the storage works. But the nice thing is that as an attacker, you don't have to actually listen to the CSI driver's permission. You can just cut out the middleman completely and communicate with all those services through the network. And the beauty of that is, even if you don't have any interesting permissions within the container, within the pod, you might have interesting permissions within the network. Now, the way those storage services work is a little bit different for each one. S3, as we all know, can have IAM authentication, or if you're very lucky, it can also have anonymous authentication, depending on a specific bucket. FSX is also IAM based, but EFS is a different beast completely, because EFS is a network-based storage solution, unlike the other two. It only lives within the local network, the VPC, in AWS terms, and it listens on NFS connections, which is kind of weird for those of you who are familiar with NFS, because on one hand, this is like a modern cloud-based managed storage solution, but on the other hand, it relies on NFS, which is a protocol that was invented in the 1980s and hasn't really changed very much since then, which introduces a very vintage set of problems. You'll see what I mean very soon. And when you create an EFS shares, by default, it has no access policy attached to it. You have to explicitly attach an access policy to it, which kind of begs the questions, what happens when you have no access policy attached? Who will be able to access this share? And the simple answer is everyone. Everyone who can see this share within the network will be able to just use these readily available NFS tools in order to connect and just read files, list files, write files, and whatever else you can do. As you can see in this command, you don't pass like a token or a username, a password, and any sort of credentials. You just have to connect to the share, and you'll be able to see it. Now, we realized that this is an insecure default, but we wanted to find out how common this insecure default actually is. So we took a look at our data, which contained tens of thousands of different EFS shares, and this is what we found. Right off the bat, only 15% of those shares had any sort of access policy attached, which means that immediately, before even inspecting any of the data, 85% were just open, available to everyone who shares the network with them, without needing to authenticate in any way. But let's dive deeper into those 15%, because out of all those access policies, 53% of them were basically allow asterisk. They still allowed anyone and everyone to just log in and view the share. You just have to see it on the network. And only 47% had any sort of restrictions at all, even lenient restrictions. So if we crunch those two numbers back together, you see that 93% of all the EFS shares we saw were completely exposed to anyone without any authentication. Meaning that anyone gaining even the most minimal foothold in the environment, sharing a VPC by either finding yourself on a pod, on an EC2, or any other AWS object that shares the network with those shares, you'll be able to access them without needing to provide any sort of credentials. You just have to see them. Now, in Wiz Research, we like statistics, but we love examples. So here's a real-life example. Now, this particular case study is actually on final stages of the disclosure process right now, so we're not going to be able to divulge the full details just yet. but stay tuned. What we can tell you is that we're talking about a Fortune 500 cloud company that runs on AWS infrastructure. And what we were able to do as customers legitimately was we were able to spawn a pod, a Kubernetes pod, that was completely network isolated, meaning that while we were inside the network, inside the VPC, any sort of traffic, any sort of request that we try to send to the internal network were blocked by some sort of firewall solution. So after bypassing that firewall solution, we started scanning the internal network, and one of the first things we found was several dozen EFS file shares. So we wanted to scan those file shares, see what sort of access levels they have, and to our surprise, all those shares are completely accessible without any credentials. Once we saw them, we were able to just view the entire contents of them. And what we found inside was pretty much staggering. Like, as you can see, those are some of the shares. It was categorized by tons of folders, each folder representing a user ID, meaning that those are private customer files. And all those files in total were about 1 terabyte of internal customer files, and they were just there. You didn't have to have any specific permissions or passwords or credentials. You just had to be with the same network in them and connect, and that's it. Everyone was able to view those private files. Okay, so after talking about sniffing the network, scanning the network, and the AWS API, let's talk about another very powerful tool in the AWS Hackers tool belt, the IMDS, and specifically pod to node escape using the IMDS. So EKS introduces a sort of unique concept to Kubernetes that doesn't exist in vanilla installations, where whenever the node wants to communicate with the Kubernetes API, it can either use the good old Kubernetes token, env secrets on disk that we all know and love, but it can also communicate with the IMDS server, the Amazon AWS server, fetch an AWS token, and then use that token to communicate with the Kubernetes API, which is a unique feature. The way it works in a gross oversimplification is that the node will communicate with the IMDS using the equivalent of the EKS get token command. It will receive a token, and then we can pass that token explicitly to Kubernetes API and run any of the kubectl get pods, nodes, even secrets sometimes, depends on the specific node configuration. And the question is, if the node can do this, why can't we? So let's say we're an attacker and running on an EKS environment, an EKS pod, and we try to use our permissions to do a kubectl get pods, for example. We immediately get an access denied because we're in some sort of weak customer pod. We don't have any interesting permissions within the cluster, as should be expected. However, we do have access to the IMDS. Now, when we have access to the IMDS, this won't be the pod's IMDS because the pod is essentially running on the node's network. It's going to be the node's IMDS. So if I, instead of communicating with the Kubernetes API directly, I try to communicate with the IMDS server. I do the same command, the AKS get token command. I receive a token. This time, this token is not the pod's token. It's the node's token. So I can pass that token explicitly to the Kubernetes API, do the same kubectl get pods command, and this time, I'll actually get all of the pods. Sounds crazy, right? Well, let's talk about this time when this actually happened. On Hugging Face, for those of you who aren't familiar, if you aren't an AI enthusiast, Hugging Face is a very big AI infrastructure provider, sort of the GitHub for AI models and AI apps. And in a recent engagement with them, we started out with executing code in the EKS environment using a malicious AI model. And once we were there, we were, as I said, running an EKS environment, an EKS pod, and just like the example I just showed you, we didn't have any interesting permissions. We were a customer pod, we tried to do any of these Kubernetes API calls, and nothing yielded, as should be expected. However, we did have access to the IMDS. So we create the IMDS for the node's access token, then we pass that token explicitly to the Kubernetes API, and this time, we had access to all sorts of stuff, including access to sensitive secret that allowed us to laterally move between customers. Now this research was done in collaboration with Hugging Face. We worked with them in order to fix those bugs, and they're all fixed by now. That's why I'm telling you this. But let's take a look at how it looked like before it was fixed. So this is a real recording of our attack. We started out by uploading a malicious AI model to the Hugging Face website. Once we uploaded it, we were able to communicate with it using the Hugging Face Inference API. Now, the way our backdoor worked is just like a regular LLM model. I can ask it, how are you? And it will go, blah, blah, MAI, blah, blah, blah. But when I trigger the backdoor and ask it to execute a Linux command, I will get the output of the command. Now, this is not some sort of AI hallucination. These are actual commands being run on the Hugging Face backend. So let's execute a reverse shell. we received this reverse shell, but right now we didn't have any interesting permissions. We were just an EKS pod with no access to anything. So let's contact the IMDS and fetch the node's access credential. Once we had that credential, we will pass it explicitly to the kubectl command and do a get pods. And suddenly, bam, we're able to see all the other customers' pods that we should never be able to see as a customer, just because we had access to the IMDS. Although the Kubernetes permissions themselves were perfect, the IMDS access was enough for us to be able to do this. Now, if you want to learn more about this particular research, because this is seriously just the tip of the iceberg, we're doing a talk at Black Hat very soon. It's called Isolation or Hallucination, Hacking AI Infrastructure Providers for Fun and Weights. It's me and my colleague Sagi. We're going to dive deep into this research and 2 other AI-related researches, so highly recommended. To sum things up, EKS is a very powerful tool. It combines the functionality of Kubernetes with easy AWS integrations with all sorts of services for any of your Kubernetes deployment needs. However, when you have this sort of combination between an Kubernetes cluster and an AWS service, it can introduce all sorts of unique pitfalls. So what we want you to leave with here today is that EKS security should be examined through both lens, not only through the Kubernetes lens, but also through the AWS lens, because if you neglect one over the other, you find yourself in some very weird gray areas like the ones you saw here today. If you want to try all these tricks out by yourself, we have 2 amazing CTF challenges developed in the team, mostly by Nir. EKS cluster games and Kubernetes LAN party. As you can probably deduce from the names, one is EKS focused and the other is focused on Kubernetes networking. And you can basically try out all these tricks that you saw here today and some more tricks and like a fun little CTF challenge. So highly recommended. All right, thank you very much. If you have any questions.
Good.
First of all, thanks for the presentation. Really nice talk. Just to clarify the last portion with the KMS, using the instance metadata. To my knowledge, only even on each node should not have access to get the access to the pod. So basically, that was only just a misconfiguration of the client, right? It's not something built by design for the Kubernetes.
Right. So it's worth mentioning that like all those things that we showed today are things that are preventable. Like we wouldn't even be talking about if it's something that AWS should fix. All these things are basically misconfigurations. You can prevent IMDS access, for example, by setting like a hop limit, so that only the node can access it, and anything that with more network hops will be blocked. And yeah, we didn't really have time to touch on how to fix all these things, but each one of them is preventable with correct configurations. So yeah, that one is also preventable.
I mean, it's not built by design like that. So you don't have to have, because to my knowledge, you don't have to have a role related to Kubernetes attached to a node to specifically be able to access the only reason why that attack happened is because the user itself put an overprivileged identity. It's not like you have to specifically put that role to the instance, right?
Yeah, so specifically, like in that case, it was like a really privileged node. As you can see, it could fetch like all sorts of tokens and that kind of stuff. But usually nodes do have like an interesting level of access, like at least to get some to get information on pods and nodes, not necessarily secrets, but lots of the times it can be more interesting than your access as a pod. But this is definitely an extra interesting example.
So with the IMDS version in question, does it matter if it's V1 or V2, and or was this attack agnostic to the version? And would I mean, obviously V1 would be fairly easy to get data from, but is it just as simple to get the same data from a V2 endpoint?
Yeah, so like the changes between version 1 and version 2 don't really matter in this particular example, because we're running our own code in this environment, so we can basically send every request that we want. So it's very similar to someone just executing code in your environment, like someone legitimately executing code in your environment. The way to limit this would be like, in our opinion, the best one would be to use a hop limit, but the version difference doesn't really make a difference in this particular one.
Maybe time for one final question. Anyone? lot of pressure.
All right, you're welcome to reach out after this or on Twitter or whatever. But thank you for listening.
Thank you guys. Thanks so much.